afternoon to our CLA family, clients, community partners, and friends. Welcome back to our live stream. And today we are going to do part 2 of our forgiveness application discussion. You know, for as many answers as we've gotten, I think more questions have also cropped up. It's kind of like, I heard an analogy this past week that I think is a good one, that the SBA is building an airplane while flying. And I think that's true. And that's what's created probably all this complexity and confusion. So today we're going to do a deep dive into forgivable costs, along with looking a little bit at retention and wage reduction mechanics. Before we get into our discussion today, I do want to start with some housekeeping. We want you to ask questions and be part of the conversation with us. Your questions are so impactful. They actually help guide our conversation today because it lets us know what's important to you. We also have professionals that are in the chat, and they are there to engage with you and answer your questions real time. Also, they'll bring them to us so we can weave them into the conversation today. Of course, as usual, after the session, if you've got additional questions, please feel free to either submit them using the links in the dialog box below, and alternatively, you can go to our website at claconnect.com and visit our COVID-19 resources page. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guests today. We are bringing back Jack Rabichi and Rick Krueger. Welcome back to the show, guys. So we began Tuesday really starting to unpack a little bit of this guidance, and Tuesday the chat was just hopping with several of the topics that we touched on. And so we're going to bring a lot of those into our conversation today. So Rick, let's start with you and really start with a deep dive related to the information on the payroll portion of the forgiveness application, talking about just what we know right now and what's still unclear, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. Thanks, Leslie. I'd say a lot of the big questions that we're getting around payroll ultimately deal with timing issues.
Yes.
So some examples of questions that we have out there and seeing in the chat and through other sources, one, can I count wages that we maybe deferred in Q1 and then paid during the covered period? Can I count 2019 profit sharing contribution that I made in that covered period? And then on the reverse end, what about expenses that I'm incurring now that'll ultimately be paid later, maybe a retirement contribution or a quarterly tax payment? The short answer to those questions and similar questions like that is we really need more guidance. I know we're all tired of saying that and hearing that, and we really hope we get it quickly. We're hearing that we're going to get a big dump of FAQs within the next day or so here, and crossing our fingers. But in the meantime, here's maybe a slightly longer answer, picking apart what we do know versus what we're still pretty uncertain about. So of the items that we do feel pretty comfortable with based on current guidance, one, any payroll costs that are incurred and paid during the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period should be includable in the calculation. And by incurred, I mean they relate to the day that the employee's pay is earned. Another example of things that we feel pretty comfortable with, payroll costs that are incurred during that covered period and paid on or before the next regular pay date are also includable. So those seem pretty clear and should allow you to get basically that 8 weeks worth of payroll in there. But where the uncertainty starts to come in is with a couple of other items. One would be payroll costs that are incurred during the covered period, but not paid until after that next regular payroll date. Those do not seem to be allowed as we're currently reading some of this. Now, people do respond back to me that the application line 1 states to enter total eligible payroll costs incurred or paid. And it definitely does use an or. I can't argue with that. I personally have hoped that they're right and I'm completely wrong here. It is their application to complete, but the couple of concerns that I'll at least share with our audience here is that position may be risky, especially if we think about the definitions and the phrasing within the CARES Act itself, where it does talk about payroll costs being incurred, costs incurred related to payroll costs, and it also, and this is paraphrasing, defines payroll costs as being payments of compensation. So we think those two elements are important when it comes to payroll costs. The other big item that we have a question mark for would be payroll costs paid during the covered period or alternative payroll covered period that aren't or that were incurred before or incurred after that period. That also seems like a risk area for borrowers. Again, a lot of borrowers are latching onto that language in the application, but I definitely would caution them that if we think about what's authoritative in the structure here, the CARES Act definitely trumps the application itself and does refer to costs incurred. So, something to keep in mind and definitely something for us all to watch as more guidance comes out. So like I said, we feel pretty good about the big item that we should be able to get 8 weeks worth of payroll in our covered period, but there still are some fairly large questions about those other related items.
Yeah, I think it's great that you laid that out. I always tell people, even in the area that I normally practice in, which is tax, that form instructions are not authority. So while I think they provide us some nice hints at where that guidance is going, we really can't rely on that. We've got to go back to the intent of the law. And I think what you've pointed out is fantastic advice. So, another area that I think people have to really think about is self-employed individuals and really how should they approach that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Now, in a lot of ways, there are some similar issues and similar structure when you think about self-employed individuals, but there's definitely some added complexity and a couple of additional questions that we're tracking and looking for additional guidance around. One is that the overall concept of what is a payment to a self-employed individual, and this also applies to active partners in a partnership as well. Line 9 of Schedule A in the application has you enter amounts paid to owners, including a self-employed individual. We're just not exactly sure what that means. For a self-employed individual, does that mean it creates some sort of requirement that they cut themselves a check? Or is there something else that's ultimately going to factor into forgiveness when it comes to them? The second issue is one that we've been tracking and mentioning for a little while now. In the April 14th interim final rule, and it continues to show up in the actual application itself in the first certification to it. There's a sentence in that IFR in question F that states that SBA has determined that it is appropriate to limit loan forgiveness to a proportionate 8-week share of the 2019 net profit. And they use the term loan forgiveness rather than just owner compensation or payroll costs. So that's what's caused us a lot of heartburn. And the application's first certification has fairly similar language, basically stating that the amount of forgiveness requested for a self-employed individual is capped at the lesser of 8 weeks of 2019 net profit or $15,385. Now that seems totally illogical if you think about a lot of the Schedule C and Schedule F businesses out there that do have employees, but pending further guidance, this remains a big concern to us.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's a huge concern just for the reasons you stated. It really doesn't seem like the ultimate intent of the law. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to come on that, and I know our chat is hopping on questions related to those topics today. Let's go to another hot topic at the moment that I think really warrants some attention, and that is the infamous utility costs. So Jack, can you help us understand what we know and then what we're still waiting on here? Because that is a hot area.
Yeah, whoever thought that utilities could be such a hot topic? Unfortunately, I do feel a little bit like a broken record here because we do have very limited guidance. And there's really two kind of main things that we're wrestling with on the utility side. The first one is cell phones. And we'll dive deeper into that. And then the second is what is a utility from transportation perspective. I think we might actually have a little bit of a guidance though on cell phones, right? And so, and I'll try to give you some practical guidance there. It's not authoritative, obviously,
Sure.
But from that perspective, we do know that telephone is included as part of the utilities, right? So at least we have that as a foundation to go from. And we also know that utilities, in order to be includable or forgivable, have to be subject to a service agreement, right? So we've got a couple things in our favor for cell phones where the company is contracting for those cell phone services and then providing cell phones to to their employees, right? Because now the company is paying for that under a service contract with their cell provider. And so I feel pretty good about that type of cell phone arrangement being included as part of utilities. Now, there's a couple other different kind of cell phone arrangements though, right? One might be where the employees use their own device at work and then they submit for reimbursement based on some percentage of time used for work versus personal. Now, in that case, I don't think those are going to be included, right? Because in that instance, the company doesn't have a service agreement, right? The company is merely reimbursing the employee for an expense. And so on that one, even though it's still cell usage, we think because of the nature of the relationship there, probably not includable. Now, the only other one that's out there that we know about is then we could give you an allowance. I can just give you $100 a month, for your cell phone, whether you use it or not, right? In that case, we feel pretty good about that it would be includable, but it wouldn't be includable as utilities. It would be includable as part of your payroll or your compensation because that allowance just goes into your gross wages, right? Mm-hmm. And so that falls under that $100,000 wage exemption or wage amount that you have to deal with, not under the utility clause. So at least, I think we can whittle our way through the cell phone dilemma and come up with reasonable answers. Now, I'll contrast that with transportation. I mean, I'm not sure what transportation as a utility is. Yep. I know in some locales, you may have a transportation fee that you pay through your real estate tax bill or something like that because you have public transportation. I think that kind of thing would be includable. But that's not really what everybody is interested in. Everybody really is worried about, can I include fuel charges and gas, right? That's the thing that's got a little meat to it, right? Because the other, charges are they're not just significant enough to worry about. But for companies that have large fleets or equipment fuel, equipment that's out there in the field for them, this could be a very significant expense, right? So I want to thank one of our viewers, though. Linda sent us a very thoughtful analysis about this, and I want to encourage you, just like Leslie mentioned earlier, please send us your thoughts on these topics because we're learning as you're learning. Hopefully we're reading a lot and we've got a bunch of people reading it, so we're passing on some knowledge here, but we'd love to hear your ideas. So Linda, in her analysis, like CLA, really thinks a lot of the confusion on this topic comes from IFR number 3. And specifically, that IFR related to self-employed individuals, and it was talking about what the different includable costs were that are potentially out there. And it actually talked about the gas you use to drive your business vehicle as an example of business utility payments that could be reflected on a Schedule C. And so from that perspective, people are starting to extrapolate that. Oh, well, if it's gas that you use for a Schedule C, why couldn't it be for our full fleet of vehicles that we use, or our construction equipment, or our trucks that, are hauling things and that kind of thing? So the answer, again, we get back to it. We really don't know the answer. I think it would be very difficult to build the case that you've got a service contract for fuel if all you're doing is going out to the pump and fueling up, right? Now, on the flip side, if you have fuel storage on site and you're having a fuel service deliver fuel to you, maybe there at least you've got that service contract element. But we do think it's very risky to be including that because that is more of a cost of good generally because you're using that in the production process more so rather than a utility to kind of keep the lights on. So thoughts on a couple topics there that, we don't have great answers, one more so than the other, though.
No, I think that's really kind of great how you reasoned your way through that. I love how you pulled in the IFR too. I mean, we have seen IFRs create confusion in other areas as well. For example, the global area. So, I think that's an area we definitely are just dying for some clarity on for sure, so that we can move forward with our forgiveness calculations and do so appropriately. Another area that we've just seen a ton of questions on is related to mortgage and rent expenses. So which one of you would like to tackle that?
Sure, I can go for that, Leslie.
Great.
Similar to payroll, I'd say some of the biggest questions also relate to timing when it comes to these expenses. That's less of an issue when it comes to mortgage interest, but definitely does affect rent and utilities. For example, can we include prepayments of rent and utilities? Commonly comes up as a question. And if so, are we limited to 1 month, 2 months? Can we get really aggressive with 6 months? Same types of things too. If we incurred some of these before but paid them during the period, people are asking how does that factor into everything, and will that count as something that's forgivable? The answer on this is pretty similar to what we said about payroll, that at this point we really could use some more guidance, and so we do think there is some risk associated with including costs that were incurred outside the covered period when you're looking at the forgivable expense pool. Again, we know that non-payroll costs, so that's your interest on mortgage obligations, utilities, and rent, that non-payroll costs that are incurred and paid during the covered period are includable. So that's pretty certain, or I shouldn't even say pretty, that is certain from everything that's out there today. We also know that non-payroll costs that are incurred during the covered period and paid on or before the next regular billing cycle are also includable. And maybe it's also important to put some of this into perspective that just like Jack said earlier, all these costs are subject to a 25% limit on the forgivable amount. So that does also impose a cap on how much you can put into your covered period and count. But at the end of the day, there still is some question around things like prepayments and some uncertainty, and people are latching on to different parts of guidance out there. But ultimately, it really is confusing because of these inconsistencies. A couple of other things that do come up frequently, and seeing some of this in the chat as well. When it comes to related party rent, we still haven't heard anything more on that. So there's nothing that specifically says related party rent is not allowed or there's a cap on related party rent, other than the fact that you definitely do need a leasing agreement in place as of February 15th. But that said, we still do wonder if it's logical that just by putting it in a separate related party leasing entity, suddenly you go from only being able to get interest to being able to get much more than that in what's included in rent. The other thing that we see a lot of is interest on other debt obligations. People ask about, is it just mortgages, or is a loan for secured equipment or other security interest includable in the forgivable costs? We do know that allowable costs, which is a different section and not directly tied to forgiveness, talks about interest on other debt obligations. That specific language is not included in forgiveness, but there are other bits and pieces that people pull out to think, maybe there's a chance that the SBA includes this. Again, we can cross our fingers at this point, but it really is waiting until some of that guidance comes in before we can be more certain on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I hear you say is it's very unclear for some of those, but at a minimum, start to gather your leasing agreements, be tracking those costs, and just be ready so that when we get that guidance, you can plug that into your calculation. So another area that we've seen is we also have a lot of nonprofit entities that are part of this chat with us, and certainly they've been participating in questions relevant to them as well. There are a couple special considerations related to nonprofits, and Jack, I would love for your commentary and feedback on what we've been seeing in the chat related to nonprofits and their concerns.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're tracking, and we have seen it a couple times in the chat today, has to do with nonprofits that receive federal funding or state funding already, right? And so some or all of their workforce might actually be getting reimbursed by another governmental program. And so there is a lot of questions on if that is the case and you're already being subject to reimbursement on another federal program, can those costs be included in what would be forgivable costs for the PPP? We had a fairly robust discussion about this about 2 weeks ago in our group, and in a lot of cases we determined we know you can't have it in both places, right? We feel very confident in that. The question really comes down to which one should it be in, and does this represent a planning opportunity, for instance, right? You might be able to still continue to provide services to your client base, and then just not submit for reimbursement under your grant agreement, if the grant agreement allows you to extend that time out. That way you can use the PPP for a couple months of compensation for your employees, and then make those federal grant dollars stretch a little bit longer, right? So that's potentially a planning opportunity. We do, feel there's some risk on that, right? Because you're still providing services. You have potentially another source to fund those services, but you don't know if those contracts are going to get renewed. And so that's where potentially the uncertainty comes up. So we are looking at that from a planning perspective. We don't have direct guidance out on that yet, but we do know that it's an issue, and we know you can't double dip there.
Great. I think we should also touch on the fact that we've had a little bit of breaking news today, if you will. We connected with Todd Sprang, really even right before we went live today, just with what we're seeing with some of the loan resizing rules and special timing of those. So I think it would be great if you can bring everybody up to speed on that, because it's a very timely and time-sensitive topic. Sure.
No, I'll be happy to do that. And happy to take a little bit of a break from forgiveness to go back to loan sizing, right? That was it's consumed us, literally just 6 weeks ago. Now, generally, we're not talking about it anymore. But there was an IFR that came out recently, about 2 weeks ago, that talked about seasonal employers and partnerships that may have undersized their loans because they did so based on guidance that was out at the time they did the application, but their subsequent guidance came out that would have allowed them to ask for a bigger loan. For partnerships, it was specific to whether or not you include active general partners in the partnership application, or whether or not they are going to have to do that themselves, right? So is that owner comp included in the partnership application? There were a number of banks that were out there that were interpreting it that no, you don't include it in the partnership, and all those individual partners will file their own guidance or file for their own PPP. The guidance did come out at about mid-April, and clarified that no, all of those partners should be included in the partnership return. We don't want a partnership with 10 partners to have 11 applications in total when we can only deal with it in one. So that guidance came out, and then seasonal employer guidance came out later on in the month of April. That gave some flexibility into the periods you use to determine the loan size. So if the stated period that were included in the guidance in the CARES Act and some of the IFRs wasn't an advantageous period to you, you could select another one where maybe your people were employed, so you could get a loan based on a higher FTE count and a higher number of people that are going to be working for you, because that's when you're going to use those dollars. And so the new IFR that came out about a week and a half ago now said that if you use the old guidance, but under the new guidance, you would be entitled to a bigger loan, you could go out and ask your bank to increase your loan size. Now, the breaking news part of all of this is included in there is some caveats. And it basically says you can only do this, or you can do this as long as your bank hasn't reported your loan yet to the SBA. Fortunately, the SBA has not been able or has not been willing to accept any of the reports that are on Form 1502 from the banks yet. However, they came out with an IFR last night that talked about moving the deadline back from May 22nd to report those from the bank to May 29th. And only within the last 2 or 3 hours, we got a notice from the SBA that basically says that tomorrow the banks will be able to start submitting those Form 1502s. So what this really means for you is if you're in one of those two buckets, either a seasonal employer or a partnership that excluded active general partners, and you want to try to resize your loan, it is imperative that you get to your bank today. Call them up, let them know you're interested in it, and ask them to exclude you from any reports that they're going to give to the SBA. They don't have to include you on the report they're going to submit tomorrow. They can submit another one next week if they want to, and then that way you'll have the time to analyze that and potentially request an extension or additional loan amount there. So encourage you all to at least think through that. And if you can't complete the analysis today, get in front of the bank and make sure they're not going to report you so you lose that opportunity.
Well, that's great. Very timely, helpful feedback. I think that, like many of the things we've seen, has attempted to do the right thing for the borrower. The catch-22, as with many of those, though, is you've got to act quickly, right? So it changes very quickly, and we've got to be responsive to that. So act if you need to on that. I'd like to spend the last few minutes here addressing some specific items that we're seeing in the chat that we haven't necessarily talked about today. I want to start first with Rick and talk a little bit about that utility definition. So, you covered the fact that it's got to be under service agreements and certain things that qualify. We are getting some questions about whether internet is considered a utility.
Yeah, great question, Leslie. And some of the ones that I've seen too, I get around what types of activity constitutes a utility. So I'll go to the actual definition itself here. Internet access is included within the definition that they give for covered utility payments, as long as you have a service agreement that indicates service began before February 15th, 2020. The other types of things included are electricity, gas, water, things that you would think of. Transportation, like Jack mentioned, which is just a broad and confusing term, telephone, and internet access.
Great. So that helps. Again, still some holes, but very helpful. The other thing that I think has been fascinating in the chat today, and I just always say hats off to our business owners because they're entrepreneurial, they're creative people, and they've heard us talk about the fact that we've got to have this service agreement in place, and certain things are really employee compensation. And so there's been some questions as to, can they start to reimburse cell phones or do some type of allowable plans with gas that consist of payroll now to really help their forgiveness calculations? And I'd be curious what your guys' thoughts are on that.
Rick, you want to give it a shot?
Sure, I'll start off here. I've definitely been seeing this question more and more as people try to think through aspects, and certainly all of us want to see forgiveness as high as possible. The closest that we have to guidance that specifically addresses this would be something that's a little bit broader than I think what people are thinking of. And that gets to what Jack was talking about around allowances, that if you give a general allowance to an employee, which normally would be taxable income to that person, that is includable in the cash compensation definition. If you're talking about reimbursing somebody for something, there isn't anything that I found that's that specific, but it would seem not to be includable to me, that it normally would fall under the definition of compensation. It's not taxable to the employee. It's really more expense reimbursement. Though I definitely can appreciate all of us trying to think through the best aspect to approach this.
No, it's great. All right, another question that Anna is asking in the chat is, ultimately, who's going to decide what's forgivable? Is it the bank or is it the SBA?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a run at this, Rick. Ultimately, the first responsibility is yours, the borrower, right? You're going to be filling out the loan forgiveness application, and you're going to be certifying as to the amount, right? The bank has a role in this, but ultimately the bank is not the final decision on this, right? They're a conduit for your information getting to the SBA, and they are responsible for doing certain things like making sure your submission is complete, tying out some of the underlying information. Some banks are making some judgments in there, but others are really just acting as that conduit. And ultimately, the SBA is the group that is going to be the one that makes that decision, right? And so if you even read the application, it talks about the fact that the SBA might tell the bank that they are not approving forgiveness, and then the bank needs to take certain actions, right? So ultimately, it is the SBA that will have the decision-making authority on whether or not you get forgiveness.
Excellent. All right, one last question that I'd like to address, and this is from Peter, but certainly we've seen many questions like his. He says, we have biweekly and semi-monthly payrolls, starting our covered period at the beginning of the next biweekly pay period. But that puts us in the middle of the semi-monthly period. So how are they going to handle the semi-monthly period? So let's just kind of step back, because I think a lot of people are dealing with maybe multiple cadences of payroll. What's your advice for dealing with that under the guidance we have right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And to give maybe just a 10-second blip of what we're talking about. So most people would start their covered period, their 56 days on the date of loan origination. Borrowers who have a weekly or biweekly cycle can shift that back just a little bit to line up with their normal pay cycles. What's not addressed, though, in any of the guidance is what happens if you have different payroll frequencies for different classes of employees. I don't actually know what the answer is to that. We certainly get that question a lot. Lots of companies have different cycles for different classes of employees. My initial thought would be the safer answer would be to assume you don't qualify for the alternative because you have that, and you still would have a cutoff issue. That mostly what they're trying to do with the weekly, biweekly shift is align it so that it perfectly matches up your payroll reports. Since this still wouldn't perfectly match up with the payroll reports, I would think that would mean you'd start at loan origination, but I certainly can't say that definitively.
Yeah, and Rick, I would think that maybe a practical way to deal with that would be to shift so at least your biweekly and your weekly might correspond to the 8 weeks, because you already know you're going to have to prorate the semi-monthly or monthly anyway, right? So that way you're only prorating one payroll cycle as opposed to prorating 2 payroll cycles. So again, I agree with you. We don't have clear guidance on that, on whether or not that's allowable. But I would think that if you did something practical like that on your application to align at least one of your payroll cycles correctly, I doubt that there would be any repercussions there.
Well, that's great. And I know we're all hoping for guidance today or tomorrow that really clarifies some more of these frequently asked questions. So hopefully we'll be able to address those next week, as well as digging into FTE reduction considerations and wage reduction tests. So with that, we'd like to really thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much for your questions, and really just remind you that as you have other questions that come up, feel free to submit those using our dialog box in the links below, or you can visit claconnect.com and go to our COVID-19 resources page, which has a lot of up-to-date information, including a demo of our forgiveness tool that we'll have available. So have a wonderful and safe Memorial Day weekend, and we will see you all next Tuesday. Thank you.